Hello, my name's Matthew, and in this Instructable I'm going to be showing you how to create this really awesome looking LED shard light. So let's begin. To create this shard light you'll need the following materials: a piece of 12mm thick MDF, a 12 by 12 cm square of 1mm thick hardwood that looks nice. You'll also need a sheet of veneer and an LED strip, a link to which you can find in the description. You will also need two pieces of plexiglass that have been broken in an interesting way. Mine are leftovers from another build where I had to trim a larger piece down and didn't do it properly, resulting in the shard-like shape. Lastly, you'll need a 12-volt power source, like a DC adapter with its connector chopped off. You'll also need two short pieces of wire and a decent length of thin 2-core wire. A cable from an old set of headphones is perfect for this. You will also need the following tools. While they're not pictured, you do need an iron and some fine sandpaper, as well as a fine-toothed saw, a fine knife, a metal ruler, a pencil and a right angle ruler, a clamp, some wood glue and a brush to apply it with, and also some silicone-based glue, though a glue gun will also be suitable. You'll also need a soldering iron and solder, wire strippers and some scissors, a drill with a small bit, and lastly some finishing oil. So the first thing to do is to draw a diagonal line which divides your piece of hardwood in two. From this line, draw two parallel lines 2.5 cm from the middle line. Use a fine saw to cut down those outer two lines, and you should end up with a shape like this. Give it a light sand to remove any jaggies. Now place your hardwood shape onto your piece of MDF and line it up with the corner. Use a pencil to mark the obtuse angles of the hardwood onto the MDF. Now use your right angle ruler to draw a square using those marks and divide the square diagonally. Cut out the square and then cut it in half along the diagonal line so that you have two triangular pieces. These pieces form the base supports. Now position your plexiglass pieces on your hardwood shape and decide where you'd like them. Once you've decided, use a fine knife or a pencil to trace their positions. Now it's time to score along your traces using the fine knife. What you need to do is clamp a ruler down onto the hardwood shape, being careful to position the ruler's edge along one of the traces you made earlier. You may also want to put some scrap wood underneath so that you don't mark the surface underneath. Take extra care not to slip and don't overshoot the edges of your traces. Once you're sure that you've cut through the wood, release the clamp and move the ruler to the next trace. Once you've done the two long edges, carefully bridge them using the knife. You can now push out the wood and be left with a slot for your plexiglass. Use the knife to tidy up any edges that need it. Follow the same procedure for the second slot. Now use some wood glue to stick the supports to the hardwood. Using a clamp is recommended to lightly hold the pieces in place whilst it dries. Next, cut two lengths of MDF to fill the sides in and glue them in place. Now it's time to cut some veneer for the sides. Usually you can cut veneer with a fine knife and a ruler, but because my veneer had strong grain, cutting it with a knife resulted in a poor jagged edge. So if you experience the same problem, use a sharp kitchen knife that has a slight curve instead. Push down hard and rock it back and forth to make the cut. It still won't be perfect, but it'll be good enough. Regardless of whether you use a fine knife or a kitchen knife, make sure that you cut your veneer slightly larger than it needs to be so that it will overlap the edges. This means that it will have a nice gapless finish once you sand it down. Once you've cut your veneer, use a knife to score the veneer into sections which correspond to the corners on your base. You don't want to cut through it entirely, but just enough so that it will bend easily at those points. After making sure that they fit properly, coat the insides with wood glue and make sure that the edges in particular are well coated. Once done, leave them to dry for an hour or two, but don't leave them longer than 4 hours. So after they've dried, carefully position the veneer onto the base. Now use your iron, with no water in it, and carefully iron over the veneer. This melts the semi-dried glue and sticks the veneer down nicely. Make sure that the edges are well stuck and be careful not to burn yourself. Leave it to cool down and then sand down any overlapping pieces using some fine sandpaper like P150. Always sand along the edge in the direction of the veneer, never across it, so that you don't accidentally pull it away from the wood. Spend a fair amount of time sanding so that you get nice smooth edges that blend together nicely. Once you've done, you can begin adding some finishing oil, which makes the wood glossy. Don't put too much on at a time, and you'll need to give it at least 5 coats to get it to be shiny. Leave each coat to dry for at least 5 hours before adding the next. Now it's time to work on the LEDs, and the first thing to do is to cut the strip into 2 sets of 3. Because of the way the strips are designed, you can do this and have 2 fully functional mini strips that still run off 12 volts. Always make sure that you cut along the designated lines in between the copper pads. Turn on your soldering iron, and whilst it's warming up, prepare your wires by exposing their ends using wire strippers. Add some solder to these ends and also add some to the pads on the strips. Now solder your wires to these pads. The polarity is marked, so I'm going to use the dark wire for the negative side and the red wire for the positive side. Cut the wires shorter and again prepare them by stripping the ends off and adding some solder. Then solder the wires to the second strip. Make sure that you keep the polarity correct. Now prepare your 2-core wire by again stripping it and adding solder. This can now be soldered to one of the 2 strips. Take note of the polarity for later, so in my case I have to remember that yellow is positive and white is negative. Check that they work by connecting them to a 12-volt power source, which in my case is the 12-volt adapter with its end chopped off. Now it's time to glue them to the bottom of the shards, so find a way of supporting the shards in an upright position. I used some holding clips cushioned with some tissue paper so that they don't mark the shards. Now add some blobs of glue in between each LED. Use glue which has some volume to it and sticks to plastic well. I used a silicone-based glue, but hot melt should work well too. After adding your blobs, place your shards on top and leave to dry. Whilst they're drying, cut 2 short lengths of MDF and glue them inside the base, adjacent to the slots. They will provide something for the shards to adhere to later, but make sure that you leave enough room for the LED strips by not making the supports too tall. Drill a small hole at the back of your base for the 2-core wire to be threaded through. Once everything is dry, tie a knot in the wire and thread it through the hole. Then carefully push your shards through the slots. Apply some glue just above the LEDs and squash it against those supports you added earlier. Now it's just a case of carefully making sure that the shards are vertical and leaving them to dry. Using the right angle ruler is a handy way of checking that they're positioned correctly. All you need to do now is hook it up to the 12-volt DC adapter and you have finished and completed it. Well done.